My name is Alan Price. I'm director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. I'm also delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. I'd like to express my gratitude to all of you who support the library, the foundation, and this forum series through your donations, your memberships, and your engagement. You are why this remains free, open to the public, and vibrant. You are very much a part of our mission to preserve history and make it accessible. And finally, I'd like to thank the library and foundation staff who envision and implement the forum series. The behind-the-scenes work of one particular evening can take up to 3 years of planning. And so without them, this extraordinary exchange of ideas and this community could not happen. And though the lights are not on them, they are in the room. If we could give the staff a round of applause. And if you would remember to silence your cell phones, we'd greatly appreciate it. About tonight's forum, I'm hesitant to say too much by way of introduction this evening because Evan Thomas has written such an eloquent, illuminating, and sometimes surprising biography of America's first female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. Drawing from exclusive interviews and access to her Supreme Court archives, he has crafted a masterful study of her life and work. And we are so pleased to have this opportunity to explore the career of this trailblazing justice in depth this evening. And just so you know, in case you are burning to do so, the bookstore will remain open. His book will be available, and Evan will stick around to sign copies of the book following the forum. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Evan Thomas is the author of 10 books. Thomas was a writer, correspondent, and editor for 33 years at Time and Newsweek. Between 1986 and 1996, he was the Washington bureau chief at Newsweek. At the time of his retirement in 2010, see how busy he was Newsweek's editor-at-large. He has taught writing and journalism at Harvard and Princeton, where from 2007 to 2014, he was Ferris Professor of Journalism. Oscie Thomas, his wife, is a lawyer and a frequent collaborator on Evan's books. She has been closely involved with First as a researcher and editor, and she and Evan conducted almost every interview for this book together. I'm also pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening. Barbara Perry is the Gerald L. Beliles Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she co-directs the Presidential Oral History Program. She has authored or edited 12 books on presidents, first ladies, the Kennedy family, the Supreme Court, and civil rights and civil liberties. She also served as a U.S. Supreme Court Fellow. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Well, thank you, Alan, so much for that very nice introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening and braving what Liz Murphy, who organized tonight's session, called pea soup. I said I haven't seen it quite this way since I studied in England for a couple of years. So thank you for being here. When Stephen Rothstein, the director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, called and asked if I would moderate tonight's forum, I said absolutely. I accepted with alacrity. John F. Kennedy is my favorite president. Therefore, this is my favorite presidential library. Justice O'Connor is one of my favorite Supreme Court justices. Evan is one of my favorite authors and fellow commentator. And Oscie is my favorite spouse of my favorite author. So this was a no-brainer, as our students would say. Just a little bit about why I was so taken with this topic of their book, Sandra Day O'Connor. My very first visit to the Supreme Court was in 1974. My parents' gift to me for my graduation from high school was my first visit to Washington, and Mother and I went into the court. And of course, it was 9 men, and as they used to be called, 9 old men, typically, because justices can serve for life. And it didn't strike me, I have to say, as odd that there were no women, but it certainly struck me in 1981 when Ronald Reagan named Sandra Day O'Connor the first woman, and it so happened that I then went into graduate school, and my first visit back to the court was in 1982, the very first term she was there. And what struck me about her was that she asked one of the first questions in the oral argument, and she had them written out, and she would read them very carefully. And that really struck me as a woman. So in 1985, as I began my dissertation, I went back to the court to interview most of the justices at that time, and I asked her if I could come and interview her about her appointment. She said yes. And I said, well, when I got there, tell me about your gender and your appointment. And then she said, well, first of all, it's so meaningful. She said, why do you think you're here? And I said, well, I don't know. And she said, because you're a woman. You're a woman graduate student. And I said, oh, yes, that is true, on both counts. So she was somewhat intimidating, but very forthcoming in her conversation with me. And then when I went back as a fellow and then as a leader of a teacher institute every year about the court, oftentimes, because she was so interested in civics, and we'll get to that in our conversation, we would bring groups of teachers from all over the country, and they would meet with her, and they would say to the teachers beforehand, now remember, you don't have to go up to her. She will go around the room and meet all of you because she's also been a politician. And she will come up to you, she will look at your name tag, and she will use your name in a sentence. And so the women teachers would meet her, and then they would run over to me, and they were almost swooning. They'd say, I met Sandra Day O'Connor. So with that as background, let's jump right into the book. And the first question that I have for Oscie and Evan is, I've always been intrigued by that description of a book as an authorized biography. Sometimes you see things by Kitty Kelly, for example, that will say unauthorized biography of Frank Sinatra. So what does it mean to write an authorized biography, and how did this come about?
Well, my publisher's been very clear that we should not use the word authorized.
Okay, strike that from the record. Forget that we said that. But it's not unauthorized.
Why is that important? Because authorized means that the family has some control over it, or total control over it. Mm-hmm. In this case, that was not the case. The one bit of control the O'Connor family had was that we were given access to all of her papers. Her papers included a diary kept by John O'Connor, by her husband, all during her Supreme Court years from 1981 to 2002. We had access to that diary. And the deal was we had to get permission to quote from that diary because John O'Connor would occasionally write something acerbic in there about his friends. They were worried about that. That turned out actually not to be a problem because it just wasn't an issue. So it's important to us actually that this is it's not like Kitty Kelly. It's not a salacious, untrue, unauthorized biography. It's an accurate biography. Yes. And I should say, and this is significant, I showed the family what we were writing. We can talk more about this, and Oscie, I want you to jump in this. But you have to have a relationship of trust with it, whether or not they have the right to say no. People are not going to talk to you unless they trust you. And the way you build trust, or the way I've learned to build trust by trial and error over the years, is to actually show manuscript to the people you're writing about as you go, because they do object to some things, and you can get into some arguments, but over the long run, by building up that trust, they will tell you more and more honestly.
The remarkable thing we did get from Sandra O'Connor was a letter, and it asked her friends and her family, the other justices, and her clerk to help us. And that opened all the doors. We had 350 interviews. She had about 108 clerks over her 25 plus years, including a clerk each year after her retirement, and we talked to 94 of them. And that's a remarkable number, because the clerks are very generally wary of journalists, as they should be. So we talked to 7 justices, we talked to many of her friends, and because she had given them permission, they opened up. We talked to her doctors as well. So, but as Evan said, the important thing, and Evan is a genius at working with families and with making them understand that when you write about a family, it's not all going to be flattering. If it were, it would be hagiography, it wouldn't be real. But we were able to do a book that has life in it and makes her come alive. Certainly that was what we were after.
Right. And have succeeded, I can say, as having read it. Let me ask about the papers. You mentioned that you had access to her papers. And as I recall, back in the 1990s, as I was going to the court as a fellow, there was actually some controversy over the release of Thurgood Marshall's papers at the Library of Congress. When he retired from the bench, he asked that his papers go to the Library of Congress and that they be released when he passed. Well, he passed 1 year after he retired, which meant that his papers would have materials in them, comments perhaps, opinion drafts of things that had just been taking place at the court. And so the court was not happy with this, but
Right.
the Library of Congress followed the wishes of Thurgood Marshall. So how did that go? Because you would be given this privileged access to papers that are not yet available to the public.
This is a really tricky issue, because when you see the papers of a justice, of course you're not just seeing the papers of the justice, you're seeing the papers of all the justices communicating with.
That's right.
So they're opinion drafts, memos back and forth, and the court has been conflicted about this internally. In fact, they have no policy because there are competing imperatives. One imperative is that justices like to be remembered and they like to be famous, just like everybody else. And so that makes them want to have it out there, and they believe in openness. The other imperative, it's all kind of, it's not kind of, it is confidential. It's secret. In fact, the clerks are all sworn to secrecy. It is a funny institution. It justifies itself by its opinion. Unlike most branches of government, when it makes a decision, it has to explain itself by its opinions. On the other hand, the process of deciding that is secret. So the court has always been internally torn. And when the Marshall Papers came out, there was a big to-do, and among the people appalled by it all was Sandra Day O'Connor. So how did she and the family reconcile this? In the following way. Oscie and I had access to her papers, to all of her letters, but when we came to her court papers, we had access up to the point that there was a living justice still on the court. And that meant Justice Thomas in this case. So we had access to all of her court papers for the first 10 years. 1981 through 1991, we saw everything, because the justices who had been with her on that court were dead or retired, the last one being Justice Kennedy. After that, we didn't have access. We were reliant on a lot of things, mostly the other clerks and the other justices. So it's a messy compromise, like many things. All of life. There were other papers, Justice Blackmun's papers, that were open that took us further than 1991. Justice Marshall's papers actually did. Well, no, I'm sorry, they didn't. But there are other ways to fill in those gaps.
Right. But that is the compromise that the members of the court have come to, that you can usually have access to things up until someone who is currently on the bench. Do you know what provisions she's made for her papers? Will they go to the Library of Congress?
Well, they're already at the Library of Congress, so we spent a lot of time in the archives there in her papers. And when her family now has control over them, and when she passes away, the library will, but there is no provision for them to be made public upon her death.
Do you know what the interval is
And
after she passes?
I think she has conditioned the release in any event on no papers will be released where there's a sitting justice that's affected.
Okay, great. Tell us then, I love the beginning of the biography about her growing up on the Lazy Bee Ranch in the Southwest. Don't you love when you're reading about historical figures, be they presidents or justices or other famous people, and you get such a sense of them from the place they came from and how they're so tied to it. So you think of Thomas Jefferson and Monticello and FDR and Hyde Park, John Kennedy in Massachusetts and the Cape and the water. Tell us about that, and you went there, as I recall. You went to the Lazy Bee, and you went with her brother, Alan?
Alan, yeah. The Lazy Bee, Sandra Day O'Connor used to say, we thought of it as our own country, because it kind of was. 160,000 acres. Wow. It took a man on a horseback a full day just to ride across it. The house, their house, which they called headquarters, was 8 miles from the road. It was a separate world. So Sandra Day O'Connor grew up in a world, for one thing, without electricity and without running water when she was a baby. There was one bath a week. Mrs. Day would take a bath, and then after she was done, the cowboys would would have it. I mean, it was a very primitive world, and somewhat of a bleak world, because it doesn't rain down there in the southeast corner, but also beautiful in a kind of austere, almost spooky way. And she grew up with this almost religious sense of the land. I mean, they couldn't go to church because church was 30 miles away. Their church was the sky, the night sky. And they worshipped in kind of a church of nature. It was incredibly, forced this family to be very intimate. I mean, there they are. They just have each other.
And she was almost an only child
for 9 years.
Until her next sibling was born.
And this shaped her.
And it was not only bleak, but it made her resilient. So our law school professor, Evan and I met in law school, and our professor, con law professor, is now on the Fourth Circuit, J. Harvey Wilkinson, and he says about her, and she was a friend, that her pet when growing up, my pet was a cat, her pet was a bobcat. She learned to fire a rifle. She learned to drive a truck when she was about 10 years old. She went out on the roundup. She rode a horse from the time she was little. She learned to be very self-reliant.
Her dad especially made her self-reliant. She liked to tell this story, that when she was 15, her job was to make lunch for the roundup. Now, the roundup could happen miles away across the prairie. So she got up at 5 a.m., she cooked the roast, she cooked the cake, she loaded the truck, she drives out to the roundup. She has a flat tire. She's a slight girl, she's 15 years old, and to change the tire, she has to jump on the jack. It takes an hour. She's late. And she gets out to the roundup, and her father looks at her and says, "You're late." And she said, "Well, Dad, I had to change a tire." And he said, "Next time, leave earlier." Now, she liked to tell that story to her law clerks. The message was clear: no excuses.
Well, it was a hardscrabble life, to say the least. Tell us about her early education, because she's out in the middle of nowhere. Where did she go to school? How did she learn as a child?
Well, she's learning a lot just being in the house, and in a house where reading was important. And she reads from the time she's about 3 or 4, and she starts reading books. She loves Nancy Drew. Her mother thinks about homeschooling her, but they think she's rather precocious, and they end up sending her to live with her grandmother in El Paso. And she goes to school from the age of 6, living with her grandmother during the school year, coming home for vacations and long weekends in the summer. And that is how she gets a good education at a girls' school called Miss Radford's, and then at the public high school, where she graduates when she's 16 years old.
She did go home for 1 year in 8th grade because she missed home. But she took the 30-mile bus trip, and the school wasn't that good in Duncan, Arizona. And she said, no, I'm going to go back to, she made the choice to go back and live with Grandma, even though she was homesick as all get out. I think her most important education actually came from her mother. Because although her father was sort of the dominant grand figure, her mother had a kind of quiet elegance. She was living out in this dusty ranch. She always wore a dress, perfume, hose, nice shoes, subscribed to Vogue, very ladylike, determined not to be a cowboy. Never rode a horse. But much more important, learned how to deal with Mr. Day. Mr. Day was a dominating figure, and when he had a drink or two in the evening, could be a bully. And Sandra watched night after night as Mrs. Day was not submissive, was not rolled, was not cowed by Mr. Day, but also did not get into stupid fights with him, did not pick fights, did not have fights for the sake of having fights. Had her own way of dealing with him, of just balancing it. And this was incredibly useful training for Sandra Day, who spent her lifetime dealing with obnoxious males.
And so that would come in handy in both her political career and judicial career,
It sure did.
which we will talk about. One thing that really struck me in reading that segment about her living with her grandmother, I'd known that she had left home at such a tender age to go to school and live with her grandmother in El Paso. And I knew she was homesick, but I had never read about the grandmother and her personality. Tell us about that.
Sandra told us that she learned to focus. She was able to hyper-focus, and that really helped being a Supreme Court justice. She was able to focus partly because she had to tune out her grandmother to do her homework. She said when her eyes were open, her lips were moving. And she would drive down into the middle of the street and say, if they come and tell you to move the car, obviously she's a child, she can't move the car, just tell them who we are. So, poor Sandra.
Sandra had a little bit of arrogance, which she got from Grandma.
But you really see, I think, in your superb storytelling, that she becomes that, as we all do. We become, right, the combination of our parents and our siblings and our grandparents and our upbringing. When I think of Justice O'Connor, I think of those formal portraits that they take of the justices when a new justice comes on, and they always take one of them lined up in seniority with their black robes. I'm sure you've seen those portraits. But then they have them in, I call their civies, in their civilian clothes. And Justice O'Connor would always wear these beautiful jewel tones and beautiful necklaces and earrings and hair always beautifully coiffed. But then I can also see her holding up the cowboy hat when she was named, was it to the
Cowgirl Hall of Fame.
That she's holding up a Stetson hat, and that she thought of herself that way. Too. So now she's got her basic education, and she graduates from high school at 16. She goes off to Stanford, which must have seemed like an oasis to her compared to the Lazy Bee. What was that like?
A week later, she writes home fairly often, and part of the joy of having this access was seeing all her letters. And she writes home a week after she gets to Stanford, and she says, "It's the utopia I've always dreamed of." And she thought that for her entire, it was 6 years there. And she, the first week, it's the Jolly Up dance. Stanford, like many campuses across the country in 1946, has welcomed returning vets. And one of her girlfriends at her girls' dorm says it was smiling men in bomber jackets everywhere. So here's this dance, the Jolly Up, and Sandra thinks of herself as having grown up on the ranch. She didn't go to dancing school, cotillion, and it's 1946, and she goes to the dance, and the girls are supposed to wait for the boys to ask her, the girls, to dance. Well, she's not waiting. She sees a good-looking vet, and she asks him to dance, and Andy Campbell becomes her boyfriend.
We met him. We met him. He was still in love.
Oh,
really?
Yeah.
I mean, he was going to visit her. He was pining for her
he
at the age of 90.
The pictures with him of her when she was.
Yeah, he brought us the photographs of her in her white piqué, is that what you call it, dress, standing in front of the windmill.
Yeah.
Well, that was something else that I learned from the book, that while I think she was always beautifully turned out, she wasn't a classic beauty by any stretch of the imagination. But I couldn't get over all the boyfriends she had at Stanford.
She was proposed to 4 times and engaged twice that we know of.
Yeah.
And my favorite story is of one of those boyfriends in law school who's in her law school class. So if you look at the picture of her class, not very large at Stanford, hardly any women. As I recall, she's in one of those 1950s shirtwaist dresses that the mothers wore in the sitcoms, like Father Knows Best. And then standing off to the one end is a very handsome future Chief Justice of the United States, William Rehnquist.
Yeah.
There's a story.
There's a story. Oscie, will you tell it?
So Sandra married her law school friend, John O'Connor. He was a year behind her in law school. And that was a very happy marriage. So Evan and I knew that Sandra had been very happily married. We asked the kids, where are the love letters? We've been through all the papers we have access to, and we haven't found any personal letters between your parents. So back at the Supreme Court, where we spent a lot of time going through her papers there, her nice secretary took us down to the basement storeroom. Each justice has a storeroom in the basement. She slid open the door, and there's a box marked correspondence. So we asked for permission to see that. We get it. We open it up. Lots of lovely love letters between John and Sandra. And also 14 love letters from Bill Rehnquist.
Do
from
tell.
1952.
Because when you think of William Rehnquist, you don't think love letters, right?
No.
You don't.
He was in love.
He was when we actually went out to the Hoover Institute where his papers are, and we saw his law school notes, and he's doodling down the side of his note. And there are pictures of girls, and we're thinking, there's Sandra in a heart. But they dated first year from April to December. And in these letters, he remembers picnics at Half Moon Bay. If you know the California coastline, that's a beautiful beach out there. And they break up in December, and in these letters, he's blaming himself. And at about number letter 7, he says, Sandy, will you marry me this summer? And this was, they had never told anyone. They didn't tell their families. They didn't tell their friends. And this sort of...
I'm convinced that even John didn't know. Her husband didn't know.
Yeah.
We saw enough of his intimate correspondence that they really didn't tell anybody.
So what happened? Why did they break up? How did she break up with him?
Well, she did string him along for a couple of months. Because she was waiting for John to ask.
Yeah, she didn't say no right away.
She didn't say no right away. And what's sweet about this story is that they became great friends, Bill Rehnquist and in fact, they were neighbors and friends, and not neighbors, but friends in Phoenix, and then pretty friendly on the court. Later, they were able to be grown up about it. He was hurt, Bill Rehnquist was. You could tell from the letters, his pride was wounded. But they met in Yosemite Park and talked it over. And this was 1952, before sex.
Yeah.
So it's easier to prepare things. And they did.
So you mentioned Jay Wilkinson, the Fourth Circuit judge. I was at a dinner one time with him and Chief Justice Rehnquist, and the pictures of young Bill Rehnquist with a full head of hair, and they had them at the court at an exhibit when I was there, and I thought he looked like a combination of Ricky Nelson and Elvis. And so I made the mistake of turning to Jay Wilkinson and telling him that. He in turn immediately turned to the chief Rehnquist and said, "Chief, Barbara thinks you look like a combination of Ricky Nelson and Elvis." So I will never do that again.
And how did the chief respond?
In his usual way, which was calm, and just smiled, gave a little smile. I had also given him a bottle of whiskey, and he would yelled across the room, "Barbara, thanks for the whiskey." And I said, "Sure, Chief, anytime." So John and Sandra Day O'Connor, the story they once told to these teachers was the following, that they met on the law review, they said, and
True.
that they, for night after night, they were checking citations, is what they said. And then Justice O'Connor said, "We went out for beers every night after we checked the citations." And then she said, "My grades began to suffer, so we had to stop." So they'd gone out for like 30 nights in a row.
40 nights in a row.
Oh my
41
gosh.
nights. Yeah.
So that was a real love match.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, for sure.
For her. And they just seemed so happy.
He made her laugh. And I think she really needed that in her life. And she needed, but almost equally importantly, she needed someone who recognized just how smart and actually how ambitious she was. She wanted a career. And this was something that Andy Campbell told us, that he recognized. He had also asked her to marry him, and he said she was more interested in the fact that my mother had a landscape business, and she would ask her how she ran her business. And she wasn't interested in moving up to Oregon to be the wife of an engineer, which is what he had become. And so John really knew from being on law review with her that she was maybe even smarter than he was. And he knew that he just respected her mind. And when well, you'll probably get into how difficult it was for women to get a job. But that fact didn't keep her from thinking that she was different and that she wanted to have a career and that she would succeed.
Yes. So if the 1950s was before sex existed, it also was prior to women having careers at the level that she was perhaps aspiring to, whatever that was, and do tell us what that is. First of all, what prompted her to go to law school and then pursue a career as a lawyer?
That's a little fuzzy, actually, because she didn't really want to be a lawyer. She didn't know. Mm-hmm. She had a professor, Professor Rathbun, who had just inspired her to be involved in civic life and to be ambitious. Mm-hmm. And also, he was pretty gender neutral about it, which was very unusual in 1950. So she did have an inspirational teacher. She loved a course called, Andy Campbell said she loved Western Civ more than me. Western Civ was a required freshman course. Western civilization. They don't teach it anymore, I'm sorry to say, because it's deemed to be too patriarchal and hegemonic today. But she loved it, and Oscie and I read her final exam, written when she's a 17-year-old. Mm-hmm. It's a brilliant exegesis on Madison and Jefferson and the rule of law. And you can see the seeds being planted as a 17-year-old girl. She got it. The question is what to do with it. And, she said, well, law school is a sort of a training ground generally for leaders. Maybe it'll be useful on the ranch in some way, but it's all very vague. When it came to, but you want to get a job. So this is 1952. And at Stanford, you can apply to a law firm. They would put their addresses up on the bulletin board if you had a B average. She was Order of the Coif, top 10% of her class, law review, near the top of her class. And so she applied to 40 law firms. She got one job interview at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, and the lawyer there asked her, how well do you type? So she said so-so. I mean, she didn't even get that job. But she was not bitter about it. She went over to the local DA. And, if you can't make it in the private sector, try the public sector. And she was glad to do that because she said to him, I want to work for you. He said, you can't, I don't have any money. She said, I'll work for free. He said, I don't have any space for you. He said, I'll work off of your secretary's desk. She did. He eventually hired her and paid her. And that was the beginning of this life in the public sector. I have to flash forward 30 years later. So 30 years later, remember the law firm that that maybe offers her the secretary's job is Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. 30 years later, the Attorney General of the United States is William French Smith, a former Gibson Dunn partner. He is now calling Judge O'Connor in her chambers in Arizona, asking her to come to Washington, D.C. to interview the President of the United States about being a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. She gets on the phone and says, "You wouldn't be calling me about secretarial work, would you?"
So she wasn't bitter, and she maintained her sense of
She
humor
did.
about it.
She did.
Well, tell us, at intervening 30 years, how does she get from just barely getting into the DA's office to being a Supreme Court justice? What is she doing, and how does she and John have 3 sons, and in her true orderly fashion, she has one every 2 years, so she has 3 sons over 6 years' time. How does she, what is John doing? How do they balance the life and career responsibilities?
Well, right away, John is working for one of the top firms in Phoenix and on the penthouse of the bank building, and he is building for himself a kind of classic, successful corporate career in law, running the hospital boards, being a Maricopa County Republican activist, and he's got himself his niche, but she's doing some of the same. But even so, when she arrives in Phoenix, she can't get a law job in a law firm. She and a guy she meets in the bar review course start a 2-person law firm in a shopping center in Phoenix. That's what they do. They hang their shingle. They take anybody who walks in the door. She does that for a couple of years and says that was good training too. And then she takes a little time off to have her kids and be home more. She volunteers to write questions for the bar review exam. She volunteers at the hospital. She joins the junior league. She ends up as president. She has so many volunteer activities that after a couple of years, she says, I have to go to work so I can have more time to myself and shed all these volunteer activities. And then she goes, she joins the Attorney General's office.
She uses her political connections. John is head of the Young Republicans in Maricopa County. She uses her political connections to get a job in the AG's office, state AG.
And then how did she get into her own political career, her elected political career?
Well, she's appointed to fill an empty place in the state legislature as a state senator, filling in for a woman, actually. But she quickly makes her name there because she's so smart and well organized. And as head of the junior league in Phoenix, she knew Robert's Rules of Order, which actually were really useful in the Arizona Senate because she understood parliamentary procedure right away. And she becomes the majority leader, the first ever woman majority leader of a state senate ever, anywhere, just on her skill. Now that took a lot of skill and a lot of forbearance because the Arizona legislature in 1970 there were a lot of men being difficult to her and to each other, actually. And so the story she liked to tell, or I like to tell about her, was that there was a fellow named Tom Goodwin who was the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. And she had to deal with Goodwin to get the budget passed. And Goodwin was a drunk by 10 a.m. drunk. And she finally called him on his drinking. And he looked at her and said, if you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose. And she said, if you were a man, you could. Yeah, that's a great story, but actually it's a one-off. She didn't get into those confrontations much. She knew when she had to stand up for herself, she did. But it was much more typical of her to just not take offense, to walk away from a stupid fight, to literally walk away from a stupid fight. It preserved her. The men would get into stupid fights. Let them do that. Let them get drunk and emotional. She didn't do that.
And you said a lot of that came from her mother, not getting into it with her dad.
Right, exactly.
Who could be the bully.
Knowing when to stand up. Keep your dignity. Don't be submissive. Don't be cowed. But also don't get into foolish fights.
And don't take the bait.
Don't take the bait.
That's key.
That's key.
Now, how does she end up in her the beginnings of her judicial career?
She is, after a couple of years in the legislature, she actually is a little tired of it, and an appointment becomes available on the trial court level in Arizona, and she gets that job. And some people would say that's sort of a step down. She is the first woman majority leader of any state senate in the country. She has a lot of power, and she leaves that to do something that is doing whatever, again, cases come in the door as a low-level trial judge, but she likes it. She likes solving people's problems that are right in front of her and deciding what the law should be. And she goes from there, and then a seat opens up on the mid-level Arizona court called the Court of Appeals, and she's appointed to that. And she does that for a couple of years. And again, she really likes being a pure lawyer. It's going back to her law school roots, really.
She got tired of trading sewer culverts for votes, you know. I mean, she wanted to do something more cerebral, and being a Court of Appeals judge is more cerebral.
But before we get her to the court in the land, this time that she's involved in politics in the 1970s, the Equal Rights Amendment is churning through the states and the state legislatures, and controversial in many states. We haven't really you said that John was in Republican circles. Obviously, she was a Republican in the state legislature. What is her ideology?
This is a very important and revealing story about her. Her ideology is that she's a Goldwater Republican. Now, that doesn't mean quite what you may think it means. In Arizona, Goldwater is not seen as an extremist. He's seen as a reformer. In Arizona politics, the Democrats had controlled the state house for years, and they were thoroughly corrupt. Mm-hmm. When they cleaned things up in the 60s, it was the Republicans in Phoenix who did it. That was so when you say Goldwater Republican, it has a different meaning in Arizona. But the more important story is about the ERA. The Equal Rights Amendment, believe it or not, was non-controversial in the late 60s. It was both on the Republican and the Democratic platform. And it passed the Senate, and it looked like it was going to get ratified by the states. But by the early 1970s, remember Phyllis Schlafly? Okay. Phyllis Schlafly, every revolution has a counter-revolution, and the women's rights revolution, women's lib as they called it in the late 60s, created a counter-revolution led by Phyllis Schlafly. So the once non-controversial ERA is suddenly seen as women are going to get drafted, and men are going to lose their power in the House, and all of a sudden there's this big backlash. So what does Sandra Day O'Connor do about this? She introduces the ERA on the floor of the House. She does, of the Senate, floor of the Senate. She introduces it, and then she lets it die in committee. And the activists were furious at her. What are you doing here? You're selling us out, and you must just be doing this to get a judgeship from Barry Goldwater. And what was she doing? She knew that it couldn't pass. Don't break your pick on something that's not going to get done. She could do a lot of virtue signaling by having a big fight over it, but why do that? Instead, what she did, and Oscie and I saw the evidence of this, she made a list by hand, which we saw, of every law in the state of Arizona that discriminated against women. And there were a lot of them. You couldn't rent cars, you couldn't own an apartment, all sorts of stuff.
You couldn't work more
than 8 hours. She changed every single law in the state of Arizona that discriminated against women. She did it quietly, under the radar. She changed every one of them. The point is, instead of making a big show of failing to pass the ERA, she quietly changed all the local laws and got it done.
And that will say a lot about how she operates on the court, won't it?
Yes.
How does she get there? How does she get to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1981 by Ronald Reagan's nomination?
He has made a campaign promise in Illinois. He's down by about 10 polling points with women. And his advisors say, do something. And he says, why don't you say you're going to make one of your first appointments to the court a woman? And he says, that's a good idea, and he does. And so now he's president, and Potter Stewart has resigned, and the Justice Department lawyers, the young Justice Department lawyers, know about the promise, but they think he meant down the road. And so they're starting to think maybe Bob Bork would be a good appointment. And William French Smith says to them, he means it. If he said, I can't believe there's not one out there in the country somewhere, go find her. And Jim Baker told Evan that that wouldn't have happened without Nancy Reagan saying she was for it. So off they go, and there are not very many choices. There are 600 federal judges, there are 8 women, they're almost all Democrats, and there's one Republican who's kind of flunked the personality test, and there's Sandra Day. Bill Rehnquist, remember him, he's now on the court, and he quietly tells the Justice Department they should be looking at Judge O'Connor in Arizona. She also had already met Chief Justice Berger, and he lobbies for her a bit. And the senators from Arizona know that they've got a good judge in their midst who's Republican and who has all the right, checks all the right boxes for Ronald Reagan. And so her name goes right to the top. Very quickly.
And she comes to Washington, right? She comes to have that interview with Reagan.
Yes.
A great photo of the two of them sitting outdoors, I think it is.
Yes.
And is there some cowboy, cowgirl connection there between the two of them?
There is, but it actually was the way out of a bit of a jam. She, as a state legislator, she had voted to decriminalize abortion in committee. And the Right to Life crowd, which is really getting, this is 1981, so moral majority, and this is a big issue now. Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court's abortion decision is 1973, so this is 8 years down the road, and there's a building tide of wanting to overturn Roe v. Wade, and so immediately it gets into the press that she has voted to decriminalize abortion. Is she, the question is she pro-choice? So with her, and we have her diary entry about this. When she's interviewed by Ronald Reagan, he says to her, there's been a lot of controversy over when life begins. And I would like to give the benefit of the doubt to life beginning at conception. And she's thinking, oh my God, he's going to ask me what I'm going to do about Roe v. Wade. But he doesn't. He never asks the question because he doesn't really want to have a controversy. If you think about it, Ronald Reagan, although he's got tremendous support from the moral majority and support from the right, what he wants to do is have a big defense budget, cut taxes, those are his, but he does not want to have a big fight over abortion. So he never asks the question of her. Mm-hmm. He knows that she personally finds abortion repugnant, but he never asks, what would you do about Roe v. Wade? How would you vote even in the privacy of the Oval Office, he doesn't ask it. And she has a sigh of relief because she doesn't really know at that point. I think she finds abortion personally repugnant, but is she going to vote against Roe v. Wade? I think she actually doesn't know at this point, but she's relieved that she's not asked. And in a confirmation hearing.
And then they talk about ranching.
And I'm sorry, I didn't finish the story. They talk about horses instead of abortion. In a confirmation hearing, she successfully ducks the question. She gets pressed on it.
She sails through pretty...
99 to nothing. Imagine that happening today.
Yeah. Hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Well, she's on the court. And tell us how that background, how she deals, she becomes, I know she doesn't like the term swing vote, but she ends up becoming the most famous swing voter in the court's history. But she's the only woman until she's joined in the early 1990s by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. How does she fit into the boys' club?
Well, she arrives basically as a celebrity. She is on the cover of Time and Newsweek. She's got the fan mail is flooded in, 60,000 letters. Tens of millions of people have watched her on television at her confirmation hearings. But at the court, the justices are now 8 men, and they've never had a woman before. And they have just voted to take Mr. off their names in front of justice. And they, the job of the junior justice is to take notes and get coffee in the weekly conference that includes only the 9 of them. And they talk about, Justice Stevens told us this, they talk among themselves about whether they can ask her to get coffee or isn't that awkward. And they decide, well, we're not going to change the rules just because she's a woman. And then she writes in her own notes, they never asked.
They never asked. The court is it's marble, it's cold. She's an Arizona girl. She would step out into the interior courtyards and turn her face up to the sun just for warmth. She is a little surprised that the men are not that glad to see her. At her very first lunch, only 4 of them show up. 4 of the 8 even show up. And Justice Rehnquist is kind of standoffish with her. Now, it turns out that he had a very bad back and he was on meds, and there are other reasons for it, but she's kind of surprised.
Do I remember that Justice Powell, though, was quite sweet to her?
Yes, he was great.
He wrote his children very often, and he wrote them about 3 weeks after she arrived that she is nothing short of brilliant, and she will make her mark on this place. He, I think, was relieved, and he did help her out at the beginning by giving her one of his secretaries to help organize her office, and he stayed close to her and remained an admirer of hers.
And didn't he like to say that he and she were the first 2 justices ever to dance together?
That was disputed, actually, because Whizzer White claimed the same thing.
Yeah. So she was still popular in that sense,
yes,
as a dancer. Let's get into some of the cases that she's most known for and some of the topics. Certainly gender. We can't start that conversation without talking about women's rights issues, and certainly abortion.
There was one of the first cases she had was called Mississippi versus Hogan, and the issue was whether a man can go to the Mississippi College for Women nursing school. And she wrote the case and made her friend Justice Powell unhappy by saying that yes, men should be allowed to go to nursing school, that there was no basis for restricting gender in terms of the profession. And that was an important decision that Ruth Ginsburg later cited in a case involving making the Virginia Military Institute coeducational. So Ruth Ginsburg joined the court 12 years after Sandra. So that was a long time to be the solo woman, and a long time before they put a bathroom in for women at the
what
conference.
Is that like then when she's joined by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's certainly much more liberal than she? And I know that there were some issues related to the fact that when the counsel would argue before the court, now there were 2 female voices, and they would sometimes get them confused.
Can you believe that? Do they look at all alike?
They call them the wrong name.
T-shirts made up, I'm Ruth, I'm Sandra.
That they would wear, but not on the bench, so it didn't help the counsel.
No, there's a touching story that Oscie mentioned, the VMI case. The issue is single-sex education, and now it's before the court. Justice Stevens, who's the senior justice in the majority assigning the case, assigns it to Justice O'Connor to write. And Justice O'Connor said, no, this should be Ruth's case. Now, this is so, Supreme Court justices, when somebody asks them, when they're assigned a case, they don't say, oh, no, it should be Joe's case. That just doesn't happen. But Sandra did it for Ruth because Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for all of you who've seen the movie, had worked so hard in this area for so long, and Sandra O'Connor thought it should be her case. And Ruth Ginsburg told us this, that she was just eternally grateful for this.
She said, I loved her for it.
I loved her for it. And when the case was handed down, she looked right at Justice O'Connor, and thank you.
Tell us about the relationship that Sandra Day O'Connor had with Justice Scalia.
That is interesting because it's a subtle thing. At first, Justice O'Connor welcomed Justice Scalia to the court because he was vibrant and lively. And the court in the late 80s was getting kind of old and tired. And Justice O'Connor knew that Scalia would bring fresh blood. But Justice Scalia suffered from a syndrome that you might call smartest kid in the room syndrome. And the room in this case is the conference room of the U.S. Supreme Court. And so that Scalia would really patronize the other. He would send out what he called ninograms, correcting them on their grammar and telling them also what to think. And the justices came to resent this. Now, this is significant, very significant, when it comes to abortion. And this shows you the subtlety of her political skill. I mentioned that Justice O'Connor was uncertain of where she stood on abortion. And on her early abortion votes, it's a little bit hard to tell. Justice Blackmun, who wrote Roe v. Wade, thought, oh my God, she's a Reagan appointee, she's going to vote to overturn it. In first few cases, maybe she's going in that direction, you can't quite tell. Well, come the Casey case in 1992. Now, these Supreme Court cases have been coming up every few years, and abortion, Roe v. Wade has been hanging by a thread because there are more and more Republicans on the court. 1992, Casey comes up. It looks like there are 5 votes to reverse Roe. In conference, there are 5 votes to reverse Roe.
And this is just before Justice Ginsburg gets there, right?
Yes.
So Justice O'Connor's still the only woman.
So it looks like in private, in secret, in conference, Roe is going down. But it doesn't. Because Justice O'Connor has been watching, and she can see that she actually wants to preserve abortion rights. And she can see that Justice Kennedy, who is a fellow Catholic of Justice Scalia's, and they're together at first. Kennedy's voting with Scalia, but the clerks are starting to joke about how Kennedy is little Nini. They're starting to be making patronizing jokes, and Justice Kennedy's a proud person, and he kind of resents being little Nini, and he resents Justice Scalia kind of leaning on him on this case. Justice O'Connor and Justice Souter secretly form a troika with Justice Kennedy to preserve abortion rights. She peels him off. She sees that he's not going to just do what Scalia tells him to do. And this is quite brave on Justice Kennedy's part, because he's already voted the other way, and he changes his vote and joins they're not liberals, but joins the moderates to preserve abortion rights. This took some guts on his part. But he did, I'm convinced that it was, and I get this partly from Kennedy's own clerks, that it was the incredible human fingertips and political skill of Justice O'Connor to sense that Kennedy could be one away from Justice Scalia at just this moment, and that's what preserved Roe v. Wade. It's still a law of the land, the Casey case.
Is it she who inserts that language of an undue burden,
yes,
that a state cannot create an undue burden for a woman seeking an abortion?
She comes up with the new standard, which is still the law of the land, that the state can impose various rules. There is one that they strike down, she strikes down in the Casey case, which is that you have to notify your husband. She says she doesn't agree with that. There could be an abusive husband, but she does let the states impose rules. But the bottom line is that women have to have access to abortion, and there can't be an undue burden restricting that.
Interestingly, this is revealing, she lets Justice Kennedy write the top of the opinion, which is full of this flowery phrases, the doubt has jurisprudence of doubt has no place in the Constitution. She hated all that stuff. She hated flowery sentences. She hated sweeping declarations. She wrote very narrow, dry, fact-based, incremental decisions. But she let Kennedy write that way because it was good for his ego. That was one way of getting him on board.
And I always think not only is she the only woman on the bench when that case comes down, she's therefore the only person on that bench who's ever been pregnant.
Yes.
And that seems to have had an impact on her because she not only seems to be keeping her eye on the bottom line of the vote tally coming out of conference, but doesn't she also mention that Americans are living their lives knowing there is access to abortion. In other words, she does look at public opinion, right?
She does. I mean, polls have been this way for a very long time now. About a third of the country is for abortion, about a third is against, and about a third is somewhere in between. And that's about where she was. And her view of the Supreme Court was that it shouldn't get too far ahead or too far behind public opinion. Mm-hmm. She didn't read the polls. She didn't have to read the polls, but she did read the newspaper. And she knew, and she was determined not to get too far out of line with where the public was.
Right. Well, we are just at the 7 o'clock hour, which means we are going to open up for questions from the audience. And we have standing mics, I understand, that are available. So, oh, good, now I can see you. Please come forward, and I like to play Alex Trebek at this point and say, if you wouldn't mind putting your comments in the form of a question, as if you were on Jeopardy, that would be superb. So let us start, ma'am, over here with you.
Thank you. I'm Ellen from the Cape, and I'm so glad to be up here because this is fantastic. Got a question about how you think she would, if she were Chief Justice on the court now, she would react to Trump.
Sorry.
Well, I think we can both separately answer. She cares enormously about civility, and she believes in give and take, and she believes in the Constitution and upholding the rule of law, and I don't think she'd be very happy.
She gave the polite version. And actually, Justice O'Connor would be polite about it. You would not hear her saying anything. Justice O'Connor had enormous self-control. This is interesting to me. She's a Washington socialite who was out all the time, night after night. She did not gossip. That is so unusual for people who are sociable in Washington. And maybe it's unusual anywhere, but for people, she's out at dinner all the time. She never gossiped. She had tremendous self-control. She let her husband gossip. Actually, I mean, I said that sort of flippantly, but there's a serious point here. Her husband, John, was the big man in Phoenix. And, but when he came to Washington, not so much. His law firm, he had to leave his law firm. It didn't work out, and he went to another law firm. And she understood that, and she was worried about his ego. And so when they went out for dinner, which was pretty much every night, she let him be the lion and crack the jokes and tell the stories. And she was sensitive to his ego. She did that for him, but also because she was very shrewd about not shooting her mouth off. So she wouldn't have shot her mouth off even privately about Trump. But he would have, I can say, he would have deeply offended her for all the obvious reasons. Because she does believe in civility and in the separation of powers and compromise, and that the parties have to talk to each other. And she once summoned the majority leader, Tom Daschle, and the minority leader, Trent Lott, to her chambers and instructed them to be more civil with each other.
She her last public statement was to a reporter when the Senate was holding up the Merrick Garland nomination, and she said, "Get on with it. You know, confirm him. Get on with it. The court should not be without a sitting justice for that long."
She was a big believer in the unwritten. She believed in the Constitution, but the customs, the unwritten rules of civility, the grease that allows, that allows government to function. That people have to be to follow customs of comedy and politeness, so she would be very disturbed by things like doing away with on judicial confirmations of going nuclear, as they say, and doing it just by majority vote. All of that would bother her.
And the fact of her moderation and diplomacy is just that at odds, isn't it, with the polarization and the incivility that we see today. Yes, sir.
I'm Mel Berger from Newton. What was the relationship like between O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg? I can understand in terms of gender equality, they were very aligned in their thinking, but they come from different points in the political spectrum and their beliefs and values. And I'm curious as to, how did they reconcile those?
I think they were quite aligned on gender questions, but Ruth Ginsburg is on the liberal side, and Sandra was, I would say, more of a moderate. We asked Justice Stevens, did she move left in her 25 years on the court, and he said yes. And Evan said, well, why? And he said, Antonin Scalia, which was interesting.
He was joking, sort of.
Yeah, yeah. So while they didn't always vote the same way, sometimes Sandra was the swing vote with the liberals, and then sometimes she was the swing vote with the conservatives.
She did. I mean, you're right. One is a city girl, and who this story we like to tell is the car story. Sandra O'Connor grew up driving a tractor when she was 10 years old. Justice Ginsburg was a city girl, So we heard from Sandra O'Connor's messenger that Justice Ginsburg rear-ended Justice O'Connor's car twice in the garage. The first time he said was hit and run. And so when Oscie and I went to see Justice Ginsburg, we saved this question for last, but said, is it really true that you cracked into Justice O'Connor's car? And Justice Ginsburg said, yes, it's true. She said, I've never driven again. And she then explained that she ran into Justice O'Connor's car because she was trying to avoid hitting Justice Scalia's car.
You have to understand also, and there are some interesting friendships on the court because Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia were very good friends. Their families had every New Year's together, and they loved the opera. And at one point, Justice Ginsburg, knowing how badly Justice Scalia was treating Justice O'Connor, went to her friend and said, you have to stop, you're losing friends. And he said that he didn't believe it and that everybody had to be, have tough skin. But so she said she tried, but she didn't get anywhere.
And as a result, Justice O'Connor had much more power on the court.
Justice
O'Connor was the decisive vote 330 times in 25 years. That's a lot of power.
Hi, my name's Bob, and from here in Boston. My question is, first off, Sandra Day O'Connor, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the brilliant people, that has ever sat on the court. Most of us don't understand the Supreme Court. We get these little blips and blurbs, and nobody knows what's going on. How did, I should say, O'Connor get along with Clarence Thomas, who, doesn't say anything? I think he's dead when he's up there. I don't know.
To answer, I went to see Justice Thomas, and he told me this story, that when he came on the court, he'd had a terrible confirmation hearing. Obviously, the Anita Hill charges were Justice Thomas said, I felt hammered. That was his word, hammered. And I felt lonely, also his word. And he said, on the first day on the court, I was walking back to my chambers feeling this way, and Justice O'Connor walked with me, and she said to me, those hearings were damaging. And Justice Thomas said, yeah, damaging to me personally, thinking to me personally, and damaging to the court. But he didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. And she didn't say anything. But the next day, she walked with him again, and the day after that. And she started saying, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. You got to come to lunch. And finally she said, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. And he said, yes, ma'am. And he did. He started coming to lunch. He said that changed everything for him. Because Justice Thomas, although he can be, as you say, pretty quiet on the bench, actually is a very funny, warm, robust figure. He's got a huge laugh, and he started coming to lunch, and he started enjoying it. And he said, you know, Justice O'Connor, she was the glue. She made this place civil. It hadn't been so civil before she came on the court, and it wasn't so, I gather it's not so civil right now. But it sounds like a small thing to go to lunch. It's not. They don't talk about cases at lunch, but it's their only time to really get together. It's a very lonely place, oddly, up there in the court. And they communicate mostly by memo. But at lunch, they have to get together. And breaking bread for her was an important thing. She would sit, Justice Sotomayor told us that she understood from the other justices that if you weren't going to lunch, Justice O'Connor would appear in your chambers and just sit there until you came to lunch. And so the attendance had been about half when she came. By the 90s, she got it up to full attendance. And that was important to her and important to those justices actually getting along with each other.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Susan. I live in Newton. I just wanted to go back briefly to what you said about the Casey case, and that she had said, you know, no undue burden for women to have an abortion. But as we all know now, there are states, you know, where women, there's one abortion clinic. Yeah. And it's very difficult. There's a huge burden on women, yeah, especially poor women.
Well, the conservative justices, because they don't want to overturn Roe v. Wade yet, have been signaling that they're going to permit more and more burdens on women that they think are not undue burdens. The problem with her standard, and it is a problem, is that it's a vague standard. And so if the court wants and the states want, they can interpret that to mean pretty much any burden is not an undue burden. That's the problem with her standard, and it's a big loophole that the states have been driving through, and the current court has been allowing them to drive through. It's hard to know where this is going. They may just overturn Roe v. Wade outright if Justice Ginsburg is replaced by a conservative justice, Judge Amy, what's her name, from Notre Dame.
Notre Dame, yeah.
Is Comey, something like that. There's talk of her, and that would be the end of Roe, not just eating away at it, but actually overturning it.
And it would go back to this state by state, which
and some states would.
In some states it would disappear, and in some states they would protect it.
Hi, my name is Don. I'm a law student at New England Law Boston. My question is whether Sandra Day O'Connor left any notes that you've got any information on the Bush v. Gore decision they had in 2000, and what her opinion on that was.
So to remind you, Bush v. Gore in 2000, Gore versus Bush, the election is virtually a tie in the state of Florida. Bush is ahead by 500 votes. And so actually the Republican Secretary of State certifies those electors, but Gore sues for a recount. And so it's a lawsuit now, and it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in December stops the recount by a 5-4 vote, in effect electing Bush. The problem is that the 5 are all conservative, Republicans and conservatives, and the 4 who want to keep the recount going, they're all Democrats and liberals, so it looks nakedly political. It looks like the Supreme Court is just on pure partisan party lines voted to elect George Bush, and so the public is understandably upset about this. So where was Justice O'Connor on this? She's with a 5. She is a Republican, and she wanted Bush to win. Yes, she did. But that's not the reason why she voted that way. The reason why she voted the way she did, and we first heard this actually from Justice Ginsburg, who was on the other side, is that Justice O'Connor was concerned that if the recount continued and Gore got ahead, and there are now going to be 2 sets of electors, because remember there was a certified slate of Republican electors. Now there's going to be a Democratic, you have two sets of electors. Believe it or not, there's a law for this, what happens if there are two sets. It's 3 U.S. Code 15. And it says that if there are two sets of electors, it goes to Congress. And the House has a vote, and the Senate has a vote. Now, the House was going to be a Republican, and the Senate was going to be Democratic, a tie. Under the law, the tie would be broken by the governor of the state. His name was Jeb Bush. So she thought, you know, this is going to look like a banana republic. The guy's brother gets him elected. We're not going to do that. She was very much, she's a little impatient. She liked to fix problems now. Growing up on that ranch, the Lazy Bee, when the windmills broke, you had about 48 hours to fix them, or the cows started to die. And sometimes the fix was ugly, sort of a Rube Goldberg, but that's her opinions were a little ugly too. She was very practical, and so they put together an ugly opinion, stopping the recount. It's been vastly criticized by every law review, right and left, and she took a lot of heat for it, and she felt the heat.
She got some comfort in knowing that it actually wasn't the Supreme Court vote that elected Bush, because 3 different times media groups did an actual recount themselves of the actual ballots. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Chicago Tribune. There was this consortium of 8 groups. They hired accounting firms and statisticians, and they took months to go through these Chads and Dimples and, you know, holding them up to the light. And they found that the recount, after the recount, the hand recount of all the ballots, that Bush would have still won, but not by 537 votes, but by 200 and some. So and just imagine, it was, so what it tells you is if you are in a swing state, go vote. It counts.
She did have some regrets. She was not one to ever regret anything. But she told the Chicago Tribune editorial board 11 years after Bush v. Gore, maybe we shouldn't have taken the case. And I asked her about this. She said, I have some regrets, but regrets don't do you any good.
That is classic, Justice O'Connor, yes.
That was to be my question, so I'll pass.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Emily. So what I was wondering is, how did Sandra Day O'Connor's family react to her position becoming the first female Supreme Court Justice?
Well, her children were adults by then, so they didn't have to move to Washington. It didn't disrupt their lives that much. I think they were used to their mom going to work every day, and used to being a figure in the community that they lived in, and they were enormously proud of her. I think that in some ways it might have been harder to be a grandchild, and maybe even because they grow up knowing, you know, throughout their lives that their grandmother was a pretty impressive, famous woman. But she has a very supportive family, and they love her, and that comes through.
Do I recall correctly that one of her granddaughters, that they're pictured on the front of a book that's called "My Grandma is a Supreme Court Justice"?
Yes,
it's a beautiful photo of one of her granddaughters,
yes.
And Justice O'Connor.
Right.
So that was good as well. We have to. Evan, did you have anything to add to that?
The oldest son said she raised her kids with 3 rules. Her sons with 3 rules. The first was be home by 6. The second was do not speak ill of others. And the third was don't hit your brother.
Words to live by. Well, we have a few minutes left. We have a few more questions left on my side, and that is, tell us about her leaving the court and how she came to that decision, and her husband John's illness.
So John O'Connor, her beloved husband, developed Alzheimer's. The first symptoms in the mid-90s, diagnosed in 2000. It got harder and harder for her because she would bring him to her chambers, and he would sleep on the bench there. But among the symptoms of Alzheimer's can be that you can't sleep, If he couldn't, they slept in the same bed, so if he couldn't sleep, she couldn't sleep. And it just got harder and harder. And finally, in 2005, she left the court. She was 75 years old. She was still fine. She was powerful as all hell. They were calling it the O'Connor court. She left. She said, he sacrificed for me, moving to Washington. Now I'm going to sacrifice for him. The problem was, terrible in any case, but within 6 months, he didn't recognize her. He's in an assisted living facility. And well, Oscie, you tell the rest of the story.
So that's just heartbreaking for her because she goes to visit him and he doesn't know who she is, and he develops what's called a mistaken attachment and to another woman who is also herself an Alzheimer's patient and who doesn't know her family. So what we heard from actually a good family friend was Sandra arrives and he's holding this other woman's hand in the couch in the common area, and Sandra doesn't know what to do, and she just sits down and takes his other hand. And that was so like her, to sort of make the best of whatever is in front of her. But this meant that instead of spending her retirement years traveling and going fishing with John and playing golf, they love to play golf, she turned instead to her great love, civics. And she decided that she should spend the next 5 years or 10 years promoting civic education in middle schools. And she started a company, a nonprofit called iCivics. And if you go online, icivics.org, I think is the website, they have video games for middle schoolers about how the government works, the 3 branches of government, the role of the courts. They're interactive curriculum for middle schoolers, and as we understand it, they reach about 6 million kids a year. So this is a great legacy, and sometimes she has said it's her greatest legacy.
And I think that's so appropriate as well. She used to tell these teachers we would bring for the Supreme Court Institute when she would meet them at the reception, and the women would swoon. And she would be so inspirational to teachers who are, of course, never paid enough and often don't get the kind of respect that they deserve. And she would tell the story. She'd say, every one of us has at least one teacher we can point to who made a difference in our lives. And she would go to Professor Rathbun from Stanford. And then she would say the final words that I will always remember from her: democracy is not genetic. You must teach every generation anew. And one of the reasons that I love the Kennedy Library so and support it is because that is one of its missions as well, is to take that inspiration from President Kennedy that most of us in this room can remember, the inspiration from that to pass on to new generations so that they will participate, understand our democracy, and participate in it. So with that, you can understand why the library is my favorite presidential library. These are my favorite authors, and Justice O'Connor is my favorite justice. So please give a warm thanks tonight.
Thank you, Barbara.
And let me say, too, Christmas is coming, Hanukkah's coming. Buy multiple books and have Evan and Oscie sign them. You will love the books, as will your loved ones.